Hello, this is an introductory video to a recent Bioessays 2023 March article entitled Evo-devo Beyond Development, Generalizing Evo-devo to All Levels of Phenotypic Evolution. The authors of the article are myself, Isaac Salazar Ciudad, and Hugo Cano Fernandez. We both work in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and I myself, in addition, work in the Center for Mathematical Research. Phenotypic evolution can be described as the movement of a population in a trait space or morphospace. Then there is three main questions one can ask. The first one is, does evolution happen and what does it require? The second one is, which processes determine this rate? Is it natural selection, drift, linkage, whatever? And the third one is the direction question itself. What determines the direction on which phenotypes evolve? That is, how traits change in relationship to each other and relationship to themselves. Classical evolutionary theory, that is most of current evolutionary theory, explains well existence and rate questions, but not so well, we argue, the direction question. The dominant view in the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology is that natural selection is the main factor determining the direction of phenotypic evolution. Other processes, like mutation or drift, are also considered to affect evolution and its rates, but without having a major deterministic influence in its direction. But natural selection can only act on existing phenotypic variants. This implies that for natural selection to be the main determinant of the direction of evolution, phenotypic variation has to be possible and equally likely in all directions. This is isotropic. If that is not the case, then the factors determining which phenotypic variation is likely and which is not have also a crucial role in determining the direction of phenotypic evolution. This is in fact a major tenet of Evo-devo. Morphological variation is not isotropic, and the processes of development are crucial factors determining which morphological variants are likely to occur in each generation and population from mutation. This is the direction of variation. Because of its role in determining morphological variation, development is seen in Evo-devo as a major factor determining the direction of morphological evolution. Natural selection will be the other major factor. In each generation and population, development will propose some directions of morphological variation, and natural selection will choose among those. This way, development and natural selection determine together how morphology changes. This is the direction of evolution. It is not exclusive of morphology. At all levels, the phenotype has to be constructed through networks of physical interactions. For example, gene product and cell interaction networks for morphology, amino acid and nucleotide interactions for protein structure as a phenotype. So, at each phenotypic level, there is a generative process, development for morphology, protein folding for protein structure. Those generative processes determine which directions of variation are going to be possible by mutation. And thus, phenotypic variation is never random or isotropic. So here you can see an example. The morphology in the left becomes the morphology in the right through a network of interaction between genes and between those genes and cell behaviors like cell division and cell signaling. The mutation in here shows that this network will actually give rise to different morphology when this interaction does not happen. That morphology in the bottom, however, will not form from mutation from any of those networks. For that morphology to form, this network will have to be completely restructured. So then this means that these three morphologies are never going to be found in the same population, or is extremely unlikely. So in that sense, this network, a generative process, determines which possible directions of morphological variation, or which variational properties, if you want, are going to occur in this population through genetic variation. Since phenotypic variation is never isotropic, as we come to discuss, explanations about the direction of evolution require two types of arguments. First, generative arguments about which phenotypic variants can arise by mutation, and second, selective arguments about which of them are going to pass to the next generation. Generative arguments relate to generative processes, to which phenotypic variation they can produce and why, while selective arguments relate to natural selection and ultimately to ecology, and in some cases to genetic drift. Classical evolutionary theory uses selective arguments, but mostly ignores generative arguments. In the past, we did not understand well generative processes, but nowadays we do, to some extent. So there is no longer an excuse not to use them in evolutionary explanations. Considering generative arguments in evolutionary explanations has a number of advantages. First, it provides a better, more complete description of the actual processes determining the direction of evolution, as we'll come to explain. Second, they provide a better capacity to predict evolution. In this article, we detail how that is possible, and we discuss specific studies trying to do that. In brief, if we can mathematically model a generative process to understand which phenotypes it will generate from mutation, then we can know which are the possible directions of phenotypic variation from which selection can choose, and then the possible path evolution will take. This is similar to what is done in quantitative genetics, but without having to assume that there is a simple relationship between genotype and phenotype. One advantage of generative arguments is that they allow to understand the evolution of generative processes themselves in a way that is not possible in classical evolutionary theory. Imagine that a specific genetic process is used to produce a specific phenotype. For example, one of the genetic networks we saw before producing a specific morphology. Then, to understand how this genetic process evolves, two questions need to be addressed. The first one is which other genetic processes can arise from it by mutation. The second question is which of them lead to actual phenotypic variation that is adaptative. Then the genetic process underlying a phenotype will evolve by natural selection choosing the variants of the genetic process that are most likely to occur and are at the same time most likely to produce adaptative phenotypic variation. So again, the direction is explained by a combination of generative and selective arguments. These kind of explanations are possible, especially if there is some understanding of which phenotypes arise from different genetic processes, for example, from some mathematical model of development or protein folding. So overall, we propose in this article that the inclusion of generative arguments into evolutionary theory, as done in Evo-devo, significantly improves its explanatory capacity because of the reasons we explain. In that sense, for the question of the direction of phenotypic evolution, what matters is not so much population genetics, but generative processes and which phenotypic variation they produce, in addition to actual natural selection. So essentially, population genetics only define the necessary conditions for evolution to happen, and which conditions actually affect the rate of evolution, but not so much the directions. To explain the directions, we need to include generative arguments too. In that sense, Evo-devo, if extrapolated and adapted to other phenotypic levels, constitutes a more general theory than the classical neo-Darwinian synthesis. Or at least that's the kind of argument we propose in this article. Thanks for listening, and that's all.